Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to chat with you guys a little bit about exercises that we can do to build up our posterior chain, our spinal collectors, things like that, that are still hip hinges, but that can replace the conventional deadlift. Now, I don't want people to think that I'm saying the conventional deadlift can't build muscle mass. Okay, that is absolutely not what I'm saying. And people need to keep in mind, if anything, I would be biased in favor of the movement. Why? Because it's my favorite exercise. I personally, and this is again purely my opinion, you might disagree with me. I don't really care if you disagree. I'm not interested in hearing your counter arguments. I've heard all the counter arguments that anyone could ever come up with regarding it being the best test of brute strength. I think it is. My opinion says me. However, I would also never say that a single exercise determines your strength. Right? We always need several exercises. All strength sports are based on that for a reason. No one single exercise determines how strong you are, because there's always going to be people who have better leverages and are more genetically gifted at any exercise. I don't care if it's a deadlift or a strict curl. Okay, there are going to be people with a leverage advantage on that one movement. So you need multiple exercises to really determine how strong someone is. We would never base it on a single movement. But that doesn't change my opinion that as far as single movements go, I feel it's pretty dang good. Again, just my opinion. And I would consider it to be the best. But I'm biased in that regard. But that aside, I don't think the deadlift is a particularly phenomenal muscle building tool. Is it decent? It's decent. It's okay. It's not great. But back over to the point. We'll get people who say, well, I've done tons of deadlifting and I built really good muscle doing it and got stronger. Well, hey, more power to you. But just because you did something doesn't mean that it's necessarily the most effective or the most efficient way to do it. And again, I'm saying that as someone who loves this exercise. Right? I love this exercise. I'm biased in favor of it. But there are better movements to do. So why? It's a stimulus to fatigue ratio. The conventional deadlift just gives a ton of axial loading. Right? It loads a large amount of weight onto your spine. If you're using anything even that's a remotely challenging weight. And I don't care how many reps that is, because again, that spinal load adds up over time. It adds up over time. You know, by that same token, something like a good morning, and some people will see me do good mornings, like, well, you're doing a lot of weight for a lot of reps. Yeah, but think about what my deadlifts would be for that same number. Okay? Like, yeah, I think here I'm doing, 265 on good mornings for sets of 20. But keep in mind, I can deadlift over 100 pounds more than my 1 rep max good mornings. And yes, I do max on good mornings. So what are we talking about? Me doing 365 or something for sets of 20? On the deadlift, that's way more axial loading. Hey, it's way more compressive stress prolonged over a long period of time on the spine. And notice again with the good morning, we don't necessarily have to load the spine the same way. Okay, it's easier on recovery. It's easier on it. And it works just as many muscles, right? All those posterior chain muscles are arguably, in some cases, possibly work better, right? Particularly maybe like some of the T-spine, upper back there. Arguably hamstrings. So if we have to start comparing different movements, for me, for any volume work, for volume hip hinging, for all of my lifters, all my clients, and at the time this video is made, I have 20 current coaching clients. And then for myself, I prefer the good morning. Is it to say that I would never have people do other movements? No, I have people do other movements. I actually occasionally have lifters even do the RDL, even though I think good mornings are generally superior. But I don't ever take the good morning out. I don't take the good morning out. I simply add Romanian deadlifts if they really and truly need a heavier hip hinge in there. Okay, but I don't program it for many people. What are other things that we would do? Snatch grip deadlifts or deficit deadlifts. Deficit deadlifts work great to a certain extent. Now, do they alleviate some of the concerns with the deadlift, because the deadlift's concern is all that axial loading combined with the fact that it's a partial range of motion on a lot of the joints, on most of the joints involved. Okay, at least we can get the full hip hinge on a good morning. Usually a conventional deadlift is a slight partial there. Definitely a partial everywhere else, right? Definitely a partial everywhere else. It's just not a complete range of motion of the majority of the joints involved. Okay, so therefore we're not getting ideal stress. There's a lot of isometric stress, a lot of compressive stress. But in terms of actual true full range of motion, or at least taking muscles to 90 degrees, right? 90 degrees of joint flexion. It just doesn't do it on many. Very, very few muscles in the body. You know, maybe the hips. Maybe, depending upon your moment arms and what your range of motion looks like on it. So the deficit deadlift can alleviate some of those problems. And number one, we're forced to use a lighter weight. In my case, like when we use something like a 1-inch deficit, I lose at least 10 pounds off my deadlift. I lose at least 40 pounds when I go to a 2-inch deficit. So we could look at movements like that and say, okay, well, with a 2-inch deficit done for reps, right? A 2-inch deficit done for reps, then we could do quite a bit less weight. Probably at 10% less weight on the bar, same number of reps, less axial loading. And by increasing the range of motion, like watch me here with a heavy deficit deadlift, like with a 2-inch deficit. Notice you get a lot deeper hip angle. Okay, the knees get a slightly more bent angle. So what does that do at the leg? Well, a little more hamstring, a little more quad. Not necessarily a lot. It's not like what you would get on a squat. Okay, definitely more hip angle though. So we get more erector, more hip flexion with less weight. So it's a little better on the stimulus to fatigue. We could do a lot of that also with a snatch grip deadlift. I don't think I threw any in here. The footage got stored into my older backup stuff because it was older footage of me doing those. So snatch grip deadlifts, and I programmed those for some of my lifters. Snatch grip deadlifts are great for that. Okay, all of these things work. They're all useful for creating a hip hinge and doing that. But also what we have to talk about is what about speed work? And that's what I'm always going to give as something as I always point out. And I have almost all of my lifters do speed pulls. Speed pulls. Why? Because we're working with much lighter weight and we're using compensatory acceleration. Even if we end up with some of the partial movements on a speed pull, let's say we're just doing a conventional deadlift, or let's say we're doing speed sumo deadlifts. Okay, yes, we still have some of the range of motion limitations of the conventional deadlift, so we could argue that sometimes the stimulus isn't perfect, but when you factor in the compensatory acceleration, the stimulation becomes pretty good, and some of the muscles involved, particularly when we do speed pulls against bands and chains, right? When we start hitting 25% or more of our max in accommodating resistance, what do? We do get some really good upper back. We get some good trap activation. Okay, a lot of that's really good. We actually have to hold the scapula together tight at the top as we hit it hard. But that compensatory acceleration, we know based upon the research, enhances muscle activation, even with a given weight, dramatically. But it's much easier to recover from. Okay, speed work is one of those things where when you're doing it, it can feel really, really fatiguing with the short breaks, but afterwards you recover relatively quick. So we could also argue that speed pulls in terms of their stimulus to fatigue work well. Again, maybe the stimulus won't be perfect because we're still dealing with some of the drawbacks of the deadlift in terms of range of motion, but we're still hitting an enormous amount of muscles through the body. And because we're hitting at least, some of the muscles are getting a good range of motion due to the amount of hip angle involved. A lot of the stabilizers are still getting hit really well. But because it's compensatory acceleration with a lighter weight, it's very easy to recover from. In fact, I would say speed pulls don't even significantly impact your recovery. Like a session of your speed pulls, they're not a big deal. The speed squats hit you harder. So in terms of stimulus to fatigue, they have their place. So when we start incorporating these things together, right? We start doing our speed pulls with the higher rep good mornings. And then if you have someone who needs a little extra tender loving care, we can do stuff like snatch grip deadlifts. You could do a Romanian deadlift. You could do deficit deadlifts, and that can bridge the gap. These are all much better hypertrophy movements than, again, most of your conventional type deadlifting, and arguably even your sumo deadlift, but that actually hits muscles a bit differently. So these are all viable alternatives if your goal is to actually stack on size, and each of them have their own performance elements that they bring to the table as far as strength and performance go. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.